Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Brenda J. Today we have Chuck Degroat on the podcast, author of When Narcissism Comes to Church. He is also a professor, therapist, and spiritual director that offers soul care intensives. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Karen.
Continuing with part 2 of When Narcissism Comes to Church.
Yeah, your book was a good reminder of we need to continue, healing each layer at a time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and what I also found interesting was when we were talking before about your shadow and opening up your bag, what you say about a narcissist is that, so you talk about how you have to feel safe, but the shadow dance of a narcissist is a dance of radical avoidance of anything that threatens his grandiosity, control, certainty, and while the narcissist lives self-defensively, he is really threatened by what is hidden within. And then you talk about the scared little boy again. And I just found that interesting that you also say, so on a narcissist, the invisible bag, it stretches miles behind them. I found that quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's we all have stories, right? And I think it's important to remember that when let's say a couple comes into my office and he's narcissistic and she's been wounded and abused by his abuse, and they talk to me about what happened in a fight that they had earlier that day. It's important to acknowledge and get behind, what happened there. Let's talk about what happened, how the fight unfolded, who said what. But it's also important to remember that these are two people with stories. And in my experience, people who are abused in their younger years, women in particular, often find their way to narcissists. It's sort of like they find their way to a man who will sort of reproduce that kind of message that they've been telling themselves, that they're not worth a whole lot more,
Right.
And so for me, it's always important to remember that when I sit down with a couple, their story is a whole lot more complex than I know. They have stories, both of them individually, that go way back, and woundedness that is coming out in the fight today, but really, probably goes back to their earliest experiences. And part of the work is really just layer by layer, kind of peeling it away and asking deeper questions and getting them to a point where maybe they can actually see one another beyond that fight, but for who they really are, and move toward one another. But that's really tough for narcissists, especially when they are trapped behind that wall that I talked about, that sort of that castle wall that keeps them from showing up honestly.
Right. And I love what you say about everybody just dealing with their own stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was funny. There was another part in your book that I thought was interesting is I've spent 3 years now healing from all the abuse and the trauma. And I read that part where you said that some people will see that as narcissistic when you actually pay attention to your own healing.
Yes.
And my kids will be like, you're being selfish. And I'm like, I need to get better.
Yes.
I can't help you if I can't help myself.
Yeah.
But the most frightening thing about narcissism's bite is that it often comes without leaving a physical wound. The trauma inflicted can look like humiliation, hypercriticism, silence, exclusion, affairs, flirtation, jealousy, extreme mood swings, crude jokes, constant jealousy, bargaining for love, guilt, shame, control of finances, sexual manipulation, blame shifting, isolating from one's friends and family, threats, boundary violations, and much more. That's a lot. Mm-hmm. You say women and men that experience this in churches can be portrayed as hypersensitive, prone to exaggeration, dishonest, delusional, and ultimately untrustworthy. Many will not ask pastors for help for fear of negative responses. And this is you speaking, in my many years of treating clients abused by narcissistic spouses, I can count on two hands the number of times churches stepped up with courage to offer empathy, care, safety, and resources. Yeah. Levine writes, trauma is not what happened to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. Mm-hmm. And I found that quite interesting. Is there anything you can add to that statement?
Yeah. So this is where we have to reckon with, okay, it's fine to talk about the story of the person with narcissistic personality disorder, maybe even to have some empathy, but we also have to take very, very seriously the debris field of pain, right? The abuse, the victims and survivors in the wake of the abuse of the narcissistic husband or pastor. Mm-hmm. And this is where I try to spend quite a bit of time to get at the different kinds of abuse that we have to face. And here's what's tricky, I think, with narcissistic abuse. I've appeared in court for a number of women over the years who I've done counseling with who have claimed that their husbands have abused them emotionally and psychologically. And judges and lawyers will try to poke holes in that. Well, where are the bruises? How do you prove emotional abuse? And those of us who've experienced emotional abuse know that it doesn't come with physical bruises, but the harm is no less real. And so, and then of course with spiritual abuse, now that's layered with Christian language and power, because it might come with, well, I'm a man and you're a woman, so you can't, whatever it comes with, toxic theology. It can be, you all probably experienced this. I know I have, women in particular who've been in contexts like this for years and years and years, and all the while didn't know it was abuse. Just sort of thought, well, he was my husband, or he was my spiritual leader, or he was the pastor. So I thought, it couldn't be abuse because he's my pastor, but for the last decade with him, he's made me feel crazy. He's called me names. He's made me feel stupid. He's lied to me and then lied about lying to me. He's, and all these things that after a while, you start to like open yourself to the conversation. You realize, oh, so he may not have hit me. I don't have a bruise on my face, but I've been profoundly harmed by him.
Right. I can totally relate to that. I love in your book where you say, grace never whitewashes abuse. Grace exposes the abuser, not to shame him or her, but for the sake of truth and healing for all. The relational posture of a Christian is anchored in our union with Christ. Anyone who lives from this depth of intimate relationship will long to be like-minded, unified, unselfish, humble, and self-sacrificial. Anything but narcissistic. It's what we most deeply long for, even if our behavior defies it. Jesus is a living antidote for narcissism. We all have to be willing to see the narcissist who lurks within each of us. And that was very convicting to me reading that, because, we all have, like you were saying, we all have that part of us that we have to deal with. And even when you talked about the Adam and Eve story and seeing, there was pride there, but there was also that sense of shame and how that all come in. So that was very interesting to me and convicting. It made me more thinking about, wow, it really is important to continually humble yourself before Christ.
Yeah, I think the way of Jesus is the way ultimately of humility. I want to live that way, but I realize that Jesus, there's this incredible passage right in Philippians 2, Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. When I see that word grasped, sometimes it's translated exploited, but Adam and Eve grasped. And so there's a sense of, I grasp like Adam and Eve for power, for belonging, for whatever it might be. And yet Jesus refused to grasp or exploit. That's a different way of living in the world, in a world that it sometimes tells us. Some of us grew up in homes where it was like, there's that sense of eat or beat and dog eat dog, win or go home, whatever it was. Mottos were. And so there's a lot of unlearning that you have to do of that toxic stuff to show up humbly in relationships. But that's the way of Jesus.
Right. That's the beauty of Jesus, is we have it's a safe thing to do with Jesus.
Right. Something that I love that you say here in your book is you say you don't need a degree in counseling to notice problem patterns and inconsistencies, or notice anxious systems or abusive dynamics. Each of us is gifted with an intuitive sense of right and wrong, healthy and unhealthy. We need to do what's necessary for our own growth. Then you talk about being attentive to the little ones, and you mentioned grace. Can you talk about why you believe training against abuse is important for churches? Because it's very important to us as well.
Yeah, so I think that these are dynamics that are largely not talked about in seminaries. I'm very interested in talking about power dynamics, power and what we do with power, how what abuse looks like, and how to recognize the dynamics of abuse, the damage of abuse. I think if we don't talk about these things in specific ways, if we don't use specific examples, if we don't say, abuse shows up in this way, and I know it's subtle, but it's real, then a lot can happen in the vacuum of that lack of information, right? And that's what I see often when I end up talking to elder boards who say to me, well, we didn't know that was abuse. We didn't know what he was doing,
right,
hurting people. You didn't know because you'd never been through a course that you and I think we both have an appreciation for the ministry of grace, a godly response to abuse in Christian environments or church environments. It's like, you don't know because you didn't do the training. You didn't ask the questions, right? And so giving people that understanding of like, this is how abuse shows up, these are the dynamics that you should look for, is really, really important.
Right. Because I told pastors that I was being physically abused, but they just didn't know what to do. And so I just thought it was okay.
That's right.
And that's part of the problem that I have with it. But we also had our podcast number 6 is with Thomas Pride from Psalm 82 Initiative. And he talks about training other pastors and coming into churches and training people, to recognize abuse and how to prevent it. So it is starting to become more recognized. Traumatized people feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive inside of them, forming some kind of gnawing interior discomfort. They learn to hide from themselves. Gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse which makes you doubt your perception of reality. The narcissist develops the uncanny ability to make others feel crazy, uncertain, confused, insecure, and bewildered. When it comes to gaslighting, you say, you are not crazy. I like that you do that. You mention that in your book. You say you are not crazy. And you also talk about the intent and impact. Can you go ahead and expound on that a little bit?
When we talk about gaslighting, it is this kind of crazy making behavior. It's too long to get into, but it comes from the whole idea comes from an old movie.
I watched it. Have you seen the movie?
No, I've never seen the movie. I've only seen clips.
Oh, it's a great movie. It definitely, it didn't happen the exact way to me, but it definitely stirs up, your feelings. Like,
I wonder how I'll feel when I watch that.
Yeah, you got to watch it sometime.
Yeah. I mean, it's as simple as like, I'll use a simple illustration sometimes for my students of a husband and wife going outside of their house and the husband saying, what incredible clouds in this, or the wife saying, oh, it's such a clear day. And the husband saying, no, there are lots of clouds in the sky and there are no clouds, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's clear. There are no clouds. And he says, I don't know what's wrong with you right now, but there are lots of clouds in the sky. So she says to herself, oh my goodness, what's wrong with me there? I don't see any clouds, and I think that happens in very real ways in marriages. It happens in ministries. I've talked to pastors, administrative assistants of narcissistic pastors who said, this happened to me time and time again in ministry. And when we talk about abuse like this, that the language of intent and impact is important, because oftentimes you'll say, well, I experienced this from you. And he'll say back to you, well, that wasn't my intention. And that's a sort of a slimy way of trying to get out of it. Mm-hmm. It's important to talk about impact for an abuser to say, well, I could easily right now talk about what I intended to do, but I want to know, how did it hurt you? That's what I want to hear from someone who has abused, and someone who's trying to take responsibility, someone who's trying to confess honestly, is tell me how that impacted you. Tell me how that hurt you. I won't waste your time trying to tell you what I was thinking, what I was trying to do, what I was trying to say. Right. That's not really important right now.
Right.
So, and that's part of the healing of abuse, is really recognizing the impact.
Yeah, I would have loved to hear that, because I feel like they know exactly how they hurt you. They don't need to, But I've never heard that type of phrase before. That would have been nice.
Yeah. Go ahead, to me, it's living in two different realities. That's when you realize, like, okay, we are not in the same reality.
No.
I love that your last chapter talks about healing, because our podcast is all about hope and healing. You say Jesus' Sermon on the Mount starts with healing for those who cry out, those who just can't do it anymore. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Matthew 5:3-4. The one who heals and flourishes often hits bottom first. On the healing journey, it is important to take seriously how you have formed your identity in and through relationship with a narcissist. how this relationship came to enslave you, and how you are being called into new freedom and identity. For our listeners who have family members or are helping trauma victims, you see how important it is for traumatized victims to hear a blessing such as, "You are so courageous," or "Your hope inspires me," or "You deserve so much more." This blessing is the first taste of new life. So that was very encouraging.
However, as someone gets away from the immediate grip of a narcissist, she realizes the depth of her self-contempt and trauma. The healing journey is about moving from self-contempt to self-love, from shame to self-compassion, from self-reliance to surrendered vulnerability. And most victims will tell you the wilderness gets darker before it gets brighter. I can attest to all that. The narcissist grip occupies psychological space. Tears of lament are shed for lost years, lost dignity, and lost vocational stability. Trauma once frozen may begin to seep out in rage or self-deprecating shame. Vacillations of emotions are common. One minute you're happy, the next you're sad. It is important to have a reliable wilderness guide in this season, a veteran therapist or spiritual director to walk you through the dark night. Would you like to add anything to that at all?
Oh, yeah. I think one thing I'd say is, and you can't put a time limit or a time frame on it.
Right.
That healing journey, right? I mean, it's like, at least as I've done this work for a lot of years, primarily with women who've taken seriously their stories of abuse, there's no microwavable way of healing that I've discovered.
No, it takes a lot longer. When I tell people that I meet with that have been abused, I can see the look on their face. They get kind of sad. I'm like, it's not a bad thing though. Mm-hmm. You know, that's when you're going through it, you realize, no, this is okay that it's taking this long.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think nowadays we want everything to be fast, to happen fast. But I think that there are models from scripture. I think that's why I used the wilderness journey from Egypt to the promised land, which, by the way, was supposed to take 11 days, but it took 40 years. And
Like a little longer.
That might be how my healing journey goes, but that's okay.
Yeah. And that's okay. And I think that one of the things that you should be aware of if you're on this healing journey is the narcissistic abuser will use that to point the finger and say, well, look at her. She's just playing the victim, or she's trying to make a bigger deal of this than it really is, and shame you and gaslight you for your healing journey and for how long it's taking, or the impact it's had, or the boundaries that you need to set, and so many abuse victims need to set boundaries. Hey, I can't see you. You need to move out. I can only talk to you via text, whatever it might be. Oh, look at her. She's playing so fragile. She's playing so using this to, she's the narcissist. I've heard that a ton of times. Well, she's the narcissist.
Wow.
The playing victim one drives me nuts because you're just such a mess. You don't even know what's going on. And you're like, what are they talking about? I'm just trying to get better.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's like, watch for crazy making gaslighting 2.0 in this season.
Yeah, that should be a red flag for sure. When we are traumatized, some of us fight, some of us flee, but trauma theorists tell us that the third response is the most toxic to our souls, the freeze response. We shut down, unable to process reality, and that may lead to dissociative response and lasting symptoms. Yeah. What advice would you give to those that are stuck in this freeze response?
Yeah. Well, I think we all need care. We all need professional care in these times with trauma-informed therapists.
Right.
But there are a lot of bad therapists out there. I'm amazed by, over the years, as I've been in different associations with therapists, not every therapist is trauma informed. A lot of therapists, because they're enslaved to the insurance model and cognitive behavioral therapy, want to get through things quickly. They want to put Band-Aids on bigger problems. But trauma-informed therapists will know what's happening in your body if you're experiencing a kind of freeze or dissociative state. They take that really seriously. They understand the dynamics of trauma and fragmentation in our souls, and they won't shame you for it. And they certainly won't tell you that there's something that you can do to snap out of it, because there isn't. And oftentimes these are Well, these are just adaptive responses of our bodies to survive in a world that's not safe. And so oftentimes that might mean somatic or body trauma work, EMDR, brain spotting. There are a number of different trauma modalities that if you work with a really good therapist, you might need to engage. I think here again, this is where you really have to prioritize your own self-care and your own healing, because an abuser will point to you to say, with any of these different nervous system responses, fight, flight, or freeze, to say, well, look at her. Let's just say fight. She's fighting back. She hit me, right? When really what you're doing is you're defending out of your fight mode because you're so traumatized that it's sort of like, it's like he's coming at me. So the only thing I can do right now is be aggressive back. And so now he's got a story to tell about how aggressive you are.
I do hear that from people.
Yeah, right?
I didn't fight back, so.
Yeah. Or, flight. Well, she just abandoned the marriage, and really it's your body's way of saying you need to protect yourself right now. So when you see trauma-informed therapists, one thing that I do know about good trauma-informed therapy is you will not feel crazy walking out of a therapist's office. You will feel validated. You will feel seen. You will feel good. They'll make sense of your story and your nervous system and help you feel a little bit more grounded. And it'll be like, oh, so for years I took that, but I can do some work toward my own healing so that I don't have to live in that kind of toxic relationship anymore.
Yeah, when I did EMDR, I had to write down, I had a book filled with trauma, and I do agree with what you're saying. When I left there, he said to me, you've had more trauma than most people have in their whole life without even the marriage and the traumatic husband. Like he just couldn't even believe it, but it actually made me feel like, okay, I'm going to be all right. Like I did leave there feeling positive. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think that like what you're saying, like I think that your book helped me realize, because my middle son just moved out yesterday and I used to homeschool. So I think my kids were just, I think they were part of how I coped in my marriage, was that I kind of poured myself into my kids. So it was definitely a grief that I had, seeing my first son had already moved out, my firstborn, and this is my middle son. I still have one more left, but it was important for me to realize, okay, I need to grieve this, not stuff it down, because I don't want it to, I just want to have healing from all of that. And so your book was a good reminder. I mean, I'm a big journaler, so I get a lot of my feelings out in my journal, but when like yesterday when my son moved out, I let myself cry and I let myself, reflect back. And, part of this as a mom, you want to go back and relive some of those, it seemed like it went by so fast. But yeah, it's like, no, this is a necessary transition and this is good. He's moving on. He moved closer to campus because he's a college student. So, but you say that two of the most important components of healing trauma are awareness and intentionality. You also say this is just as important a component in the church as an individual. Anything else you'd want to add to that?
I think that these are two important words because what they remind me of is why we need to take this so seriously. Like awareness is about waking up to the impact that we were talking about earlier on our bodies, on our emotions, on our self-talk. And so a lot of people, I'll say, who've experienced trauma are sleepwalking through life. Like they're just kind of numbed to the reality of what's happening around them.
Yes.
And when they wake up, when they become aware, there's this sense of, ouch, that hurt. This hurts. This is damaging to me, to my, so awareness awakens us. And then intentionality is any person who's done any kind of recovery from trauma will tell you that the default mode is to go back into their old survival responses, fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And so every day, we've got to wake up and be sort of ruthlessly determined to live in the reality of that wilderness we were talking about earlier. Like part of me wants to go back to that abusive spouse, but the reality is this is a season for grieving, for mourning, for taking seriously what happened to me. But that's hard, and this is where we need support, right? Because if we're going to live with awareness and intentionality, we need some courageous friends and therapists in our lives to say, yes, this happened. This is real. I mean, I was on a Zoom call with a friend yesterday who has experienced some trauma. She herself is a trauma therapist, and she was kind of reciting what she had experienced recently. And I said, I believe you. And those 3 words were so important to her. That's all she needed, in a sense, was here's this man, because men have hurt me. But so here's this man who sees me, heard my story, and he believes me. That's so significant. So yeah, awareness, intentionality, so important.
Yes, that's great. I love that. And I just had one quick question before we end. So that freeze response, is that why Karen and I get a lot of people that even after, 20, 30 years are still unable to talk about it? Is that the freeze response that they're going through?
Yeah. Yeah. The freeze response is a kind of a shutdown mode that our body has, right? It's, when your computer's shut down, they've been on for, 15 minutes and they whoop up the screens. There's like the screensaver, but everything else is kind of shut down in the background. People can live 5, 10, 20, 30 years like that, sort of shut down to their emotions, shut down to reality. So yeah, it's now these are God-given trauma responses, right? We know that animals in the wild have these same kinds of autonomic responses. And these are ways, if you were victimized, let's say at a very young age, this is a way of enduring that suffering. But, and I forget what your original question was now, but I think, the reality is we've got to sort of acknowledge that and say, this is how I've been living in the shutdown mode, but I want to heal from that. I don't want to live like that any longer.
Yeah, that was the answer to the question. Will you say that each of us is beautiful and broken, hiding and hidden in Christ, knowable and utterly mysterious? Even if we can define and categorize our pathologies, our Enneagram habits, or our Myers-Briggs types, we are still blind to significant spaces in our soul. You say that you have never seen real growth occur without suffering, humiliation, disappointment, and pain. The way of transformation is the cross, a journey in which our sufferings make a way for resurrection. Philippians 3:7-11. To end, with everything that is going on in the world right now, I just love this quote from Eddie Hillesum, the Dutch Jew whose journey to inner healing allowed her to grow into a generous and hospitable woman. She says, "True peace will only come when an individual finds peace within themselves. When we have all vanquished and transformed our hatred for our fellow human beings into love one day. Perhaps that is asking too much, but is, however, the only solution." We just wanted to thank you so much for being on our podcast, and we were wondering where our listeners can find you on social media and where they can buy your book. Or books, I should say. I think you have several books.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the work you do and for having me on. And yeah, if someone wants to track me down, it's www.chuckdegroat.net. Degroat is Degroat. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook by the same name, Chuck Degroat. And so not hard to find there. And the books you can buy at any major bookstore, including Amazon. But I always tell people, if you've got a local bookstore in your town or an independent bookseller, I know it's quicker to get it from Amazon, but go and order it from your local bookstore in your town. Yeah, I've got a number of books out. Last one being the Narcissism book.
Yeah, I want to read your other books. That one on Exodus sounds interesting too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for educating our listeners on narcissism. This is huge. People, it's just such a big, I'm sure narcissism is really, and people misunderstanding it and not being able to diagnose. Yeah, we really appreciate your expertise. It's been incredible.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm really grateful to have the time to spend with you. And again, thanks for your work too.
Well, thank you. We appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there. And if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening. And until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.